Ladies, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program will start now.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Shelley Menon, and I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of New Haven. And as President-elect of CCAS, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the opening plenary session of the 2024 CCAS annual meeting. I hope you enjoyed the events from yesterday, and it was fun to see so many of you at the reception last evening. I'll start with a brief history and overview of this wonderful organization. Founded in 1965, the Council of Colleges of Arts and Sciences, or CCAS affectionately, is the National Association of Colleges of Arts and Sciences. CCAS fosters excellence in colleges of arts and sciences and represents over 800 deans and over 1,200 associate and assistant deans. It serves as a forum for the exchange of ideas and information among deans of arts and sciences from the member colleges and as a representative of the liberal arts and sciences at a national policymaking level. The Council further seeks to support programs, activities, and resources to improve the intellectual stature and public understanding of the disciplines of the arts and sciences. More than half of the undergraduate instruction at each of our institutions is offered by colleges of arts and sciences. Many member colleges are also responsible for a wide spectrum of master's and doctoral degree programs. CCAS members, therefore, represent the largest component of American higher education in publicly and privately supported universities and colleges. The Council is concerned with the problems, possibilities, and interests of these institutions. Eligibility for membership extends to baccalaureate degree granting arts and sciences units in accredited universities and colleges, both public and private. The Dean of an Arts and Sciences unit is the voting representative in CCAS. Members include nearly 500 institutions in the United States, Canada, Kazakhstan, Kuwait, Morocco, and Qatar, from across all sectors of higher education. The governing body of CCAS is a board of directors, which consists of the officers and 12 directors who serve staggered 3-year terms. Officers and term representatives are elected by the membership at the annual business meeting each November. This year's election results will be announced on Friday at lunch. It is now my pleasure to invite the current CCAS board members to please stand. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you for your work on the board. Next, I would like to invite the new board candidates to please stand. Now, a little about this year's program, which I had the privilege to help organize in my role as president-elect and annual meeting chair. The theme of this year's meeting is Navigating Uncertainty, Deans as Change Leaders. And we will certainly need to become adept navigators of some choppy and uncertain waters on the horizon. You should know that all of this has been possible only because of the able leadership and guidance of Amber and Alexis, board members, and planning committee volunteers. Thank you to Amber and Alexis and this year's planning committee volunteers. Please stand so we may recognize you. Amber shared some helpful tips which I'd like to pass along to you. If you haven't yet, please download the Whova app. Tonight's reception at Antone's Club will feature a live duet, heavy appetizers, a bar, and Texas beer tasting. On Friday, we have a deaning while diverse breakfast, the details of which are in the Whova app. General plenary sessions happen in the same room right after breakfast on Thursday, and lunch plenary sessions happen on Thursday and Friday. We are very excited about the lineup of speakers and look forward to their presentations. Be sure to also attend the closing plenary session on Saturday at 11:30 a.m. This year, Dr. Leslie Cornick, president of CCAS and longtime board member, will be talking about A View from the Other Side, featuring her experiences as a dean and with CCAS that prepared her for her new role as provost at California State University, Chico. This is a unique presentation for us and promises to be both poignant and insightful. We want to thank our local partner sponsor, Podium Education, as well as our sponsors, HERS and Academic Impressions. Please take advantage of the many opportunities to get to know one another through the breaks, meals, sessions, and activities. Remember to vote for board candidates before 9 a.m. Friday. And for anything you may need, look for Amber or Alexis and check in with the team at registration. They are here to make this a terrific week for you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our current CCAS president, Leslie Cornick, who will present this year's Advocacy Award. Leslie Cornick, as I mentioned, is the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Chico State. Before joining Chico State in January, she served as the Dean of the School of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics at the University of Washington, Bothell. She was Associate Dean of STEM at Eastern Washington University. And Dean of Research and Sponsored Programs, and Professor of Marine Biology and Policy at Alaska Pacific University. She has been recognized for inclusive and visionary leadership and collaborative decision-making, and is a champion of the liberal arts and sciences education. For over 20 years, she has worked in marine and international conservation research, focusing on the ecological physiology of marine mammals and the human dimensions of anthropogenic impacts in the ocean. Dr. Cornick has authored or co-authored over 40 publications on topics ranging from physiology to ecology to policy to best practices in higher education. She has been invited as a speaker for several professional and public venues, including Alaska Public Radio. She has served on the Board of Governors for the Marine section of the Society for Conservation Biology, including as founding diversity officer, policy officer, Science Officer, and Congress Chair for the International Congress for Conservation Biology. Her PhD in wildlife ecology is from Texas A&M University, her master's in physiology and behavioral ecology from San Francisco State, and her bachelor's in biological anthropology from the University of California, San Diego. She was awarded an NSF Minority Postdoctoral Fellowship to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. She's an alumna of the HERS Leadership Institute, the American Association of State Colleges and Universities Millennium Leadership Institute, and the Berkeley Executive Leadership Academy. Please join me in welcoming Leslie to the stage.
Thank you, Shaylee, so much, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. And I shortened that bio, but man, we really need to shorten these bios. It's my honor to present the Advocacy Award this year and to share in conversation with this year's awardee. The CCAS Board of Directors has honored individuals and organizations with the Arts and Sciences Advocacy Award since 2008 in recognition of their exemplary advocacy for the arts and sciences, flowing from a deep commitment to the intrinsic worth of a liberal arts education. Just to highlight a few of our recent recipients, some of you might remember last year we honored Joy Connolly. Freeman Rabowski has been a recent honoree. Frederick Lawrence, the Secretary and CEO of Phi Beta Kappa Society. The list is just really extraordinary, and all of the previous recipients are on our website if you're interested in learning more. This year's recipient is Dr. Lynn Pasquerella, the president of the American Council on Education. Lynn Pasquerella was appointed president of the American Association of Colleges and Universities in 2016, after serving as the 18th president of Mount Holyoke College. She has held positions as provost at the University of Hartford and vice provost for academic affairs and dean of the graduate school at the University of Rhode Island, where she taught for more than 2 decades. A philosopher whose work has combined teaching and scholarship with local and global engagement, Pasquerella has written extensively on medical ethics, metaphysics, public policy, and the philosophy of law. Her most recent book, What We Value, Public Health, Social Justice, and Educating for Democracy, examines the role of higher education in addressing some of the most pressing contemporary issues at the intersection of ethics, law, and public policy. Pasquerella is immediate past president of the Phi Beta Kappa Society and the host of Northeast Public Radio's The Academic Minute. She's a graduate of Quinebaug, am I saying that right? Quinebaug Valley Community College, Mount Holyoke College, and Brown University. Her awards and honors, and this list is long, let me tell you. Her awards and honors include receiving the President's Award and Judith Krug Medal from Phi Beta Kappa, the William Rogers Award and the Horace Mann Medal from Brown University, the Star Scholars Network North Star Lifetime Achievement Award, Mary Baldwin University's Algernon Sidney Sullivan Service to Humanity Award, the Council of Colleges of Arts and Sciences Advocacy Award, I lost my place, Quinebaug Valley Community College Champions Award, and the Mount Holyoke Alumni Association's Elizabeth Topham Kennan Award. She holds honorary degrees from Elizabethtown College, Bishop's University, the University of South Florida, the University of Hartford, the University of Rhode Island, Concordia College, Mount Holyoke College, Bay Path University, and St. Mary's College. And she was named by Diverse Issues in Higher Education as one of America's top 35 women leaders. She serves on the boards of the Lynn Foundation, the National Trust for the Humanities, the Coalition for the Common Good, and Handshake. Please join me in welcoming Lynn Pasquerella, President of the American Council on Education, to the stage.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh.
Isn't this cool?
It is very cool. Oh my goodness.
All right, well, you don't have to carry
Okay,
it.
good.
We'll
Thank you.
We'll set it on the table here.
First, before we start, I want to clarify, because Ted Mitchell would be very upset. I'm president of the American Association of Colleges and Universities.
Oh,
Ted is president of AAC&U, so he'd be surprised to know that
Sorry
he's
about
been
that.
replaced.
Demonstrating my fallibility in front of 400 people. So let's start with your own academic and professional journey. You've had such an interesting and impactful career. What were the 2 or 3 most transformational moments in your career, and why?
That's a great question. My academic journey started, as you mentioned, at Quinebaug Valley Community College. I'm a first-generation college student. Neither of my parents had the opportunity to graduate from high school. My father joined the war effort after Pearl Harbor Day at the age of 16, and my mother got married at 16 at a time when you couldn't be married and stay in school. And so she gave up her dream of being an English teacher. They both spent their lives working in factories. My mother became a single parent by the time I was 11, and she became chronically ill as well. And so while I had an opportunity when I graduated from high school at 17 to attend my state's flagship university, I gave up a full scholarship to attend a local community college so I could be a caregiver for my mother. And it was the best and only decision I could have made at the time. I had wonderful mentors there. Within 2 years, I transferred to Mount Holyoke and then went off to Brown to get my PhD in philosophy. And when I graduated, I vowed to never forget the lessons I learned in that transition from community college to the Ivy League. And so I left with a deep and abiding commitment to access to education, regardless of socioeconomic background, to the centrality of liberal learning, and to political scientist Benjamin Barber's notion of colleges and universities as civic missions, where we not only educate people to be free, but we free them to be educable by serving as a visible force in the lives of those who have been most underserved in our society. And I was so fortunate to work at the University of Rhode Island, the University of Hartford, and Mount Holyoke College, where each of those institutions understood the critical importance of serving as anchor institutions, demonstrating that our success is inextricably linked to the psychological, social, educational health, economic well-being of those in the communities in which we're located and those we seek to serve. And so in teaching courses at URI in the prisons and at the University of Hartford, leading a research team that actually started when I was at URI in Kenya, looking at clean water solutions, sustainable agriculture, and entrepreneurship for women in the West Lake District in Kenya, in a population that was 33% HIV positive, 80% of the families were polygamous, and where they still practiced widow inheritance. And then going into Mount Holyoke, where I was still teaching every semester and taught philosophy for children to second graders at the Martin Luther King Jr. School, and looking at the ways in which we can create access through our service and anchor institutions. And you mentioned the Academic Minute. It's another example of the ways in which we can get over what Michael Sandel has talked about as the last acceptable prejudice in the United States in his book, Tyranny of Merit, as the stigmatization of the poorly educated. And we've seen this played out in the recent election, where there's a lot of rhetoric around the fact that it's our fault in higher education. It's because the educational elite have stigmatized the poor, and they're not going to take it anymore. They're going to send us a clear message. So the Academic Minute is 90 seconds, because it's an academic minute. And it is intended to introduce listeners to the cutting-edge teaching and research that's taking place on college campuses across the country and around the world. And it is just one way that we can serve as public intellectuals. Now, I'm mindful of the fact that this is NPR, but we need to use whatever vectors are available to us to get out the message about what it is that we do, because so many people don't understand that our colleges and universities do research on cancer or childhood asthma that we are working in our communities and with our communities, taking advantage of local epistemologies. And so those opportunities to work at these institutions have had such a profound impact on me. And I think about Nancy Cantor, who's now at Rutgers, who's at Hunter, was at Rutgers and in Syracuse before that. And she says, we need to take this outside-in perspective on higher education and stop asking what we're good at and ask, what are we good for? And what do people need from us? And so those opportunities at each of those institutions have really shaped my life and my career.
Thank you for that. And I still can't believe I said ACE. I was at ACE last week. So much of your work, including your most recent book and the work of the AAC&U as a voice and force for liberal education, is at the intersection of higher education and democracy. Given the trends we're seeing in the US, certainly the results of the election, the political influence in education, legislative overreach, and a renewed focus on free speech and academic freedom, what do you see as the role of our deans in these conversations, especially given the pressures that they may face in some states and regions? And what we saw this week in the changing demographics of how people voted.
Yeah. I think this is in a moment of enormity for American higher education, and it needs to be considered against this backdrop of what's happened over the past few years, the worst global pandemic we've seen in more than a century, the changing portrait of America as a result of shifting values that issued forth from polarization and partisanship around vaccines, around how to allocate scarce resources, a whole range of issues. The growing skepticism around the value of a college degree, rising mistrust in higher education, in all institutions and in each other, the burgeoning mental health issues that our students are experiencing, recent reports that depression, despair, anxiety have surpassed financial considerations as the primary reason students are either dropping out of college or not starting in the first place. All of these are brought to bear on what it is that we have to do as leaders in the academy. And we also know that there's unprecedented levels of governmental overreach into institutional autonomy and shared governance at our colleges and universities. While there have been attempts to suppress academic freedom and institutional autonomy in the past, what's different about this is the nature and scope of these efforts. So we have legislation in 46 states that have proscribed certain speech around divisive concepts, race, gender, ethnicity, other so-called divisive concepts. There are intrusions into the appointments of campus leaders, attempts to limit tenure, to circumvent shared governance around promotion decisions. And I could go on and on, book bans. And so I think we have to look at our roles as reaffirming the public purpose of higher education and our nation's historic mission of educating for democracy. And at the same time, talk about the transformative power of the personal purposes of higher education and not lose those, pointing out that this narrative, which I believe is a false narrative around higher education, is one that needs to be redressed if we are to continue to provide all students with access to the kind of education we've been privileged to receive, and recognizing that if we don't, we are in danger of perpetuating what Thomas Jefferson referred to as an unnatural aristocracy, where only the most privileged, richest students get to go to those institutions that preserve the traditions of the liberal arts and sciences.
So I think that's a perfect segue to my next question. You mentioned the conversations about the value of higher education, And a lot of that conversation now has transitioned in our institutions to think, and certainly at the legislative level, about workforce development, social mobility, return on investment. So as a philosopher, talk about the role of the humanities and social sciences in that conversation, and how deans can help shape the narrative about the importance of a liberal education.
I think one of the best ways to shape the narrative is to tell our own stories about how we have benefited from liberal education, from the humanities. In the book, I give two examples of that. When I was at Quinnebog, one of the courses I signed up for during my first semester was a course in American literature. And believe me, there weren't many students who signed up for this course. There were about 6 of us in the class, because most people were enrolled in courses they thought could get them better jobs or any job at all. But during the course of the semester, my professor, Alice Letney, I still remember her, arranged for us to go see a Hartford performance of Tad Mosel's All the Way Home. And I had never been to a professional production before, and Hartford was a world away to me. It was known only to me as the place that my father traveled nightly on a 3rd shift bus to work at Pratt & Whitney as a welder. But I remember piling into a car with my classmates, and I was dressed in a blue velveteen jumpsuit because this was the 70s after all. And I can remember sitting in that theater in the dark, and perhaps especially in the dark, looking ahead at the stage and waiting for what I couldn't yet see. And then after the play, my friends and I went out to a Chinese restaurant, and we talked about the play and the themes of grief and loss and trust. And we discussed the last act, in which a wife mourns her husband's unexpected death and says, "I hope he loved being," recognizing the fact that he never lived up to his full potential. And what I remember about that night, and why I remember it all these years ago, is that we all deserve a right to experience being, to live our best and most authentic selves. And the humanities provides us with a framework for living our best, most authentic lives, and to circumscribe the opportunities of students who are those who are at the lowest socioeconomic rungs, who have least opportunity, and say that they should only be shunted into courses that are going to help them get immediate employability, erodes the opportunity for them to live their best and most authentic lives, and runs the risk of contributing to what I think is America higher education's most significant problem, and that is the growing economic, racial, and economic segregation in higher education. And then a second story I tell is when I was at URI, and then I taught for a couple of years at the Brown Medical School, I used to ask my students in the section on death and the meaning of life to give me the name of their maternal great-great-grandmothers. I taught this course for 20 years, and not once could anybody give me the name of their maternal great-great-grandmother. And perhaps this would be different now with the advent of Ancestry.com and other genealogical databases. But I would say to them, look, here's a woman who lived maybe 150 years ago. She's responsible for your very existence. You can't tell me anything about her. You can't even tell me her name. So what hope is there 150 years from now that anyone will know anything about you or even know your name? Wow. And if there's none, then does your life now really matter? So this I know, yeah. This was a cruel thing to do, I admit.
It makes me want to go back and get a philosophy degree,
Right.
though.
I mean, so you can imagine in the fall semester how many calls I got after Thanksgiving saying, "What have you done to my child who is morose?" But of course, being students, they would say, "Well, what's the answer? What is what is the answer?" And I would say to them, well, for me, I find meaning and purpose in my life through service to others, and only half jokingly through baseball. Now, I'm a Red Sox fan, so it's sometimes a struggle to find meaning.
Sorry,
But-
not sorry.
I know. All right.
Go Dodgers.
But I refer I referred them to an article written by philosopher Morris Raphael Cohen, who talked about the Jewish immigrant experience to America around baseball. And he says the sport provided them with a mystic unity with something larger than themselves. And I think this is what all of our students, indeed all of us, are searching for, a mystic unity with something larger than themselves. And the humanities can provide them with that, connecting allusions to the past with what's happening right now, engaging in humanistic identification, imagining what it's like to be in the shoes of another different from oneself, allowing us to flourish fully as individuals and as members of our communities. And so that's how I would start. And then I would pull out the data from AAC&U, which shows that employers are looking for college graduates who can work on diverse teams, can speak across differences, write, speak, and think with precision, coherence, and clarity, anticipate and respond to objections. We have years of data reaching back to 2007 that show that now more than ever, we need those humanistic skills, competencies, and dispositions in the workforce. So that would be my response.
I love that. You mentioned the 46 states where there's legislation attacking diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice efforts on our campuses. And those efforts, I think, are going to face even deeper attacks in the new administration. What advice would you give to deans, particularly our women and deans from minoritized populations and in regions that are experiencing these legislative overreaches, to actually be able to continue to advance the critical equity work for our students in that landscape?
First of all, take advantage of the resources available to you at AAC&U, at CCAS, because you're not in this alone, and this work is so isolating at times. I have never seen such moral distress where campus leaders feel coerced into making decisions they believe are unethical, but they feel they have no choice. And in many instances, that moral distress has morphed into moral injury, where there is a continual erosion of one's moral compass, and one suffers a kind of post-traumatic stress in the jobs. And so in order to exercise moral courage, we need to engage with others in reality testing and support for grappling with that question of how much individual injustice do you countenance for the sake of long-term reform? I mean, that's really the question. And for some of you, it will be none. I can't do this anymore. And for others, will be I'm going to try to subvert from within, or at least reform, as opposed to dismantle. So I think that's where I would start, and know that we have good reasons for maintaining momentum around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mentioned the statistics around mental health and despair among our students. Faculty are experiencing equal amounts of distress, and we have to address both of those. And we can do that by pointing out that it contributes to attrition. In order to retain our students, and all state systems care about this, we have to pay attention to what causes them to drop out. It's not just mental health, but other pressures. And we know, if we look at Sia Verschelden's work on cognitive bandwidth, that racism, sexism, homophobia, food and shelter insecurity, ableism, and other forms of discrimination contribute to the reduction of students' ability to learn, and it causes them to drop out when they feel overwhelmed. She also points out that belonging uncertainty is the biggest bandwidth stealer among our students. And so at these times when students are being told they don't belong, and when we're trying to return to this false notion around merit and positioning excellence as somehow inconsistent with diversity and inclusion. We have to tell those stories and say this is a matter of, it's our responsibility to help students in this regard. So rely on folks like Kate Denial, who does work on pedagogies of kindness. Think about ways in which we can employ pedagogies of kindness, not only in the classroom, but in our institutions. Mays Emad, who is at Connecticut College, talks about trauma-informed pedagogies and ways in which we can infuse the humanities, arts, into even our STEM courses, so that we're looking at educating the whole person. And this is one approach. And then read Jarvis Givens' book on fugitive pedagogies, where he talks about the ways in which throughout history we've had to take advantage of subversive acts and tactics. When it came to educating African American students, we can use employ those same pedagogies today in trying to meet the demands of social justice and equity at a time when they are truly more important than ever.
So two things I would say. One, I'm going to get that book list from you and we'll put it on the CCAS Connect. And if you haven't read Cognitive Bandwidth, that is one in particular that was transformational for me in the last couple of years. And it's small, it's an easy read, and it completely changed my thinking about how these big issues really impact our students. And it can really help change the deficit mindset narrative that many faculty have about students as being lazy and academically unprepared and all of those things, when in fact, literally, they don't have the bandwidth to do what we've asked of them. So we still have about 20 minutes, Amber, is that right? To take some questions from the audience. There should be microphones running about. So I would invite, please, to have anyone who has questions for Lynn. I know you're all fully caffeinated. Clearly I was not.
Well, while we're waiting, there was an interesting story about cognitive bandwidth. I had, SIA just came out with a second edition of this. I had the opportunity to write the foreword for both editions. In the first edition, I mentioned the interstitial space that so many of our students are in when they're trying to bridge the divide between their families and the education that they're receiving. And I think I shared with Leslie when I graduated from Brown, I invited my father to come to my commencement, and he said, like, first of all, I'm not gonna spend $1 a gallon in gas to go up that hill in Providence. So it tells you how long ago it was. And second of all, don't you think this makes you better than us? Because it doesn't, and you're not. So like a simple congratulations would have been fine here, but it was a reminder of how so many people feel threatened by education. They're so worried that their children are going to be distanced from themselves, that they're going to no longer share the values that they were raised with. And so I mentioned the J.D. Vance and his hillbilly elegy in the foreword, and I can't tell you how many letters, hate letters I got as a result of this. Now I'd probably be praised for it, but so I just, it's funny, the ways in which our cultural backdrop changes so rapidly.
Yes.
Just a few years later, I made sure not to mention J.D. Vance. And now I think, I should have flipped this.
That's such an interesting perspective, when you think about, I've really been thinking a lot about the election and the impact of the rural non-college educated voters who voted overwhelmingly for President Trump. And I recognize that we have a variety and wide range of political perspectives in the audience, and this is not a value judgment in any way. The feeling that, at least the pundits' conversation, that what happened in that groundswell was a feeling that they have been decidedly left behind in the conversations about the impact of inflation and the economy and the cost of living and on their social mobility and their economic well-being. And so I wonder if you have thoughts on, you know, as educators, regardless of political persuasion, as educators, how do we reach back out to the rural working class and support their opportunities for social mobility, whether they come to our colleges and universities or not?
Yeah. Well, you know, when I think about my father's concerns, I was able to sit down and have a conversation with him at the kitchen table. We need to have those conversations across the country at kitchen tables. We need to create a kinship with those in our communities, because for decades we've talked about the fact that higher education is too expensive, it's too difficult to access, doesn't teach students 21st century skills, and now there's a narrative that says our campuses are bastions of liberal progressivism that are aimed at educating the next generation of snowflakes to melt at the slightest abrasion of their sensibilities. And while we can deride that narrative as misguided, it has an impact. And the only way to change that narrative, understanding that in this post-truth era, controlling the narrative is often more important than the facts, is to be trusted by those we are attempting to communicate it to. So it doesn't matter how many facts we drag out, what we say, if people don't trust us. And so the only way to restore trust is what I said earlier with respect to Nancy Cantor's perspective: work alongside our communities to create access and take advantage of local epistemologies in ways that transform our institutions away from what people perceive them to be, which is existing in the ivory tower as a willful disconnect from the practical matters of everyday life.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Yes.
Hi. I just want to make sure the microphone is working properly.
Yes.
I want to thank you, Dr. Pasquerella, for all your leadership. I mean, it's been amazing to be a part of AAC&U for a long time. And everything you're saying today, I think, is reaffirming what people need to hear today. And probably all my colleagues in this room are shaking their heads. I have a really tactile and tangible extension of what you're saying. My name is Wendy Burns Ardolino. I am the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Downtown and University of Houston Downtown. We are a minority serving and Hispanic serving institution in the city of Houston. And I would say that our students are probably some of the best examples of what you were speaking about in terms of coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, largely first gen, largely Pell eligible students, and we are really in the trenches in terms of continuing to do the hard work of fostering liberal education as the way, the truth, and the light for our students. So to that end, we have proposed a QEP that focuses on transferable skills, which I think some people think is very aligned with workforce development in a very standardized way, but we are also trying to frame that as a discourse of precisely the critical humanistic skills. We're naming those skills and aligning them with, for example, the data that you're talking about that employers are looking for in terms of diverse teams and team building, collaboration, communication, all of the things. So I wonder if you might articulate just a little bit more clearly how you envision mechanisms, methods, pathways for us to lead that discursive reshaping of the narrative for liberal education, even as I know we are poised on this precipice of a QEP, a quality enhancement plan through SACS, that we really need to dot our I's and cross our T's on. Thanks.
Thanks for that question. I think about this a lot. When I started college, I went to school under Pell Grants, Perkins loans, but also CETA funds, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. So I was working 35 hours a week in ways that allowed me to apply the liberal education I was receiving to the workforce. And for far too long, we have created this false dichotomy between preparation for work and a liberal education. And we know that it is the best preparation one can get for the workforce. I think a lot about the ways in which today the SERP studies show that we've reached the highest percentage of students ever. 87.9% of students say that their primary reason for going to college is to get a job. And yet, only 35% of students upon graduation report that they're in careers that they find meaningful. So we need to align meaning and purpose with career aspirations. The Bates-Gallup studies have shown that 95% of students want meaningful, purposeful careers. This is no surprise. But we haven't done a good job at helping students prepare for the workforce and for lives of meaning and purpose. And this has to be our responsibility. We have relegated this to career services offices, but it has to be part of the academic curriculum. Every department needs to be provided with incentives for helping students understand why they're being asked to do what they are being asked to do, to reflect on that, and then to create a narrative. So I'm thinking about, Jeff Salingo's book, There's Life After College, when he talks about the striders and the stragglers and those who are sprinters, and and he says those who do the best upon graduation are those that can create a compelling narrative around curriculum to career. They've had internship opportunities related to their career aspirations instead of working at McDonald's, and they can tell a story to employers in a compelling way. We have to give students practice with that. And in the book I mentioned the experience that one of my sons, Pierce, had. And Pierce is in television and film production. And one day when I was president of Mount Holyoke, he came into the library in our house, and I was writing a speech, and my husband John, who's an entomologist, was reading bug books, and Pierce's twin brother Spencer was working on a senior thesis. Who's a Hampshire college student. And Pierce looked around and he said, "This is the most dysfunctional family on the planet." I said, "Probably not, but what do you have in mind?" And he said, "You're sitting here doing nothing. We need to be out doing things out in the world." And I said, "I'm pretty sure you have some things to be doing in the world that involve study." And he said, "No, Mom, I'm taking courses in intercultural competence and small group communication. What I need is to get behind the camera." And I said, okay, right, and then sure enough, when Pierce went to graduate school, his first job was with the Jerry Springer Show, which of course is every mother's dream. And pointed out to him very clearly that we are not the most dysfunctional family on the planet. But he called me from the green room one day, and he said, "Mom, I finally understand why I needed to take courses in small group communication and intercultural competence. I had to run out and get the talent, ties, and cigarettes, and then I had to spend the next 2 hours in the green room with them." And he said, "I get it now. But why didn't anybody tell me why I needed to take these courses?" And so I think, here's a child of a college president and a 40-year professor. He would have been at the verge of dropping out if he didn't have a financial safety net, if he didn't have us for parents. So how can we help students understand why we're asking them to do what we're asking them to do? If we cannot do that, then we shouldn't be asking them to do it. So using e-portfolios, providing paid internships for all of our students, which we did when I was at Mount Holyoke, understanding this was the easiest money I ever raised, was to provide paid internships, but knowing that this makes an enormous difference for students. Being clear about the learning outcomes and then infusing career preparation throughout the curriculum. when I was at Mount Holyoke, we started a program called Link, and we actually had our students practice going up and down an elevator, giving an elevator pitch, and talking about how their education prepared them for the next job. And so these are things that we have been reluctant to do because faculty criticize us for the corporatization of American higher education and reducing the work we do to employability, tuition in exchange for jobs. But it is absolutely our responsibility right now.
So you just made me think of another question, because, I always think about how when we're at these meetings, we're in a room full of deans who, have drunk all the Kool-Aid, right? And so how do deans and quite frankly provosts and presidents have this conversation with our faculty about, preparing students for the workforce is not a dirty word, that we can infuse the arts and sciences and humanities across the curriculum in ways that still support that intrinsic value of higher education, because we know, especially, we think about how PhDs are trained, and we're trained to generate more junior PhDs. And we know that the majority, particularly at regional comprehensive institutions, the majority of our students are not going to go on to be academics. And so how do we have that conversation with faculty to help them understand the value of that integration of preparing students for the workforce?
I think relying on faculty leaders, but also our disciplinary societies. I mean, we have Paula and Jim here from, Paula from MLA and Jim from American Historical Association. And we need to think about the ways in which faculty cultures are created in their departments, in their disciplines, and that we can't change those cultures without trusted leaders within those groups. To talk about the ways in which we need to upend our tenure and promotion processes and start recognizing teaching excellence and the kind of work I've talked about in serving as an anchor institution, community engaged learning courses, pedagogies of kindness. The biggest influencer in the happiness of college graduates is whether they were able to talk to their professors outside of the classroom, whether they were engaged in long-term projects that lasted a semester or more. This takes a lot of work, and we don't recognize it. If it's not a peer-reviewed journal article, if it's not a grant, we tend not to give it much credence. So I think that's where we have to start. Trusted faculty members, our disciplinary societies, and working through our associations.
Question over here?
Is it okay?
Yep, there you go.
Very inspiring message. I'm Nicole Williams from Winona State University, and my background is in math. And I want to tell you, anytime you tell somebody you're a math teacher, a counseling session ensues. And part of it I see is that in first grade, kids are getting pre-test and post-test and labeled below expectations, we'll say. And every parent will come to me and say, my kid is not up to par. In first grade, they're ready, feel like they're not part of the team. So how do we overcome that? Because I tell my pre-service teachers all the time, make sure every kid feels like they're part of the team. They're in first grade. You don't want this to be the highlight of their life. And you want them to feel like they want to keep learning. So do you see any way around that besides we get rid of the labels, or do you have any suggestions?
I do have many suggestions about I think, Carol Dweck's work is really important in this regard, that this fixed mindset needs to be abandoned in favor of a growth mindset, that our students are so so anxious about failing and the stigma of failing. We have to look at excellence as a process. And this just requires reforming K through 12, but also working closely with K through 12. And I mentioned teaching philosophy for children to second graders. When I taught that course, we were teaching them basic philosophical principles around how to disagree with one another, how to construct arguments, and to come to some agreement on shared objectives. And we would use Frog and Toad, Morris the Moose, The Important Book, The Giving Tree, a whole range of children's books. And one day when I was teaching for the second or third year there, I was walking down the hall for the first day of class with my students from Mount Holyoke, and a fourth grader peered around the corner and he said, pointing to the second grade class, "Those are the philosophers, they're going to change your lives." And it was really gratifying. And what we did at the end of the class was to bring students onto our campus, and we brought them to the art museum and asked them to critique 2 paintings, and we brought them to the chapel where they got to listen to the organ and find out how sound is made. And we brought them to the biology lab where they could play with sea urchins and learn about sea urchin reproduction. And then we had a commencement ceremony in which we gave them a button that said, "I'm a philosopher," and it had Frog and Toad or Morris the Moose on it. And every single one of them said, "I want to go to college, can I come here?" And that's the first time they had stepped on a college campus. They're second graders, but it was the first time many of their parents had engaged in the college community. So I think we need to not only adopt this notion of excellence as a process, but also look at the ways in which we create hidden barriers for our students to take advantage of what we have to offer. So I am, toward the end of my teaching at the University of Rhode Island, I abandoned high-stakes tests. I mean, I never really had high-stakes tests. I had many opportunities for students to demonstrate proficiency, but I, at the end, allowed my students to take their exams over as many times as they wanted. And it was always the A students who wanted to take them over and over again. It was never the C students or D students, like, yeah, I'm okay with this as long as I pass. But I think just providing those opportunities, and I mentioned Kate Denial's work around pedagogies of kindness, allowing students to contribute to the syllabus, to the curriculum, to shape a curriculum around students' fears, anxieties, desires, their objectives, what goals, what they want to learn. And having that move into K through 12 is really important. Those are my suggestions.
So I think we have microphones set up now. So yes, please. And go ahead, Jeff.
Excuse me, Jeff Roberts, Dean of Science at San Diego State University. I'd like to return to the subject of higher ed's public image, which we all can agree is at a low point right now. But I'd like to offer a hypothesis that if you talk to people and ask them, what do you think of higher education? Mm-hmm. Oh, it's nutty, it's crazy, snowflakes everywhere. But what about your local college? Mm-hmm. You know, pretty good. Just as people hate the House as an institution, but tend to appreciate their representatives. And yet, the most visible thought leaders and representatives of higher education, and we're all complicit in this because it's such a hierarchical organization, are the leaders of a relatively few number of institutions that are disconnected, frankly, from me. The House hearings last year showed what a disaster it is when we allow a small band of institutions to create the narrative that the public as a whole sees. So what are your thoughts on how we can elevate and promote the thoughts and the positions and the perspectives of at a national level of leaders from the kinds of organizations that most of us represent, which I think are generally appreciated by our local communities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for raising that. ACE did studies on this very notion of higher education, showing that people do value their local colleges and universities. It's higher education as a whole that they mistrust, and they're not even clear what constitutes higher education. I had a couple of thoughts in listening to your comments. One is that we need to stop engaging in this hierarchy of value around types of colleges and universities. So when I go to the grocery store, I'll ask the person at the cash register, so are you going to college? And they will often say to me, no, I'm just going to community college. And I say, but that is college. And so we have discounted the institutions that are often the most transformative institutions of higher education. And like you, I'm dismayed at the conflation that happened in the hearings on the Hill around what's happening on elite college campuses and residential liberal arts colleges with the rest of American higher education. And so we need to push back against that. And when I was at Mount Holyoke, Richie Neal was our congressperson. And I see him all the time in my commute I live in northeastern Connecticut, and our offices are in DC, so when I go back and forth, I will often see him and say, hey, Richie, what can we do to restore public trust in the promise of higher education in general, liberal education in particular? And he said, meet with us and tell your stories about how you're impacting your local communities, and we'll get the word out there. But we have lost this in this politicization of higher education. And I was listening to, and this reinforces your point, I was listening to MSNBC yesterday morning, and Joe Scarborough was saying, everybody's blaming somebody for Harris's loss, but he said this is higher education's fault because
That enraged me yesterday.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So what's happened is, you've got these campus leaders who are allowing pro-Palestinian protesters, and you can't control your campuses, and you're allowing transgender athletes to compete with women on women's sports teams. And my friends who are Democrats, he's saying, have their children going to college and they're paying a lot of tuition, and yet they're afraid to speak up because the liberals are chilling speech, and it's all your fault that Harris didn't get elected. And I was like, okay, that's one narrative.
That was a whopper.
Yeah, but this is a narrative we need to take seriously. And so the only way to do that is to be in our communities, tell our stories, talk about the impact that we're having, and have our graduates, our alumni, meet with high school students, with families, community members, to talk about the impact that their education had on them and will have on the communities. I still live in the community where I was raised, and so I get to talk to friends I grew up with. Their lives are radically different from mine, and if I didn't tell them about what was happening in higher education, they wouldn't know. So we need to get outside of our echo chambers, talk across differences, and be in community in ways that we haven't had to in the past.
Thank you. I have a burning question, but I want to make sure that we have the opportunities from the audience. You are so wonderfully well read, and I'm curious, over the course of your adult life, and maybe even as a kid, what were the two most impactful books that you've ever read? One fiction, one nonfiction.
Oh my goodness.
And I hope somebody's writing down all the books that she's recommending.
Yeah, I was asked a similar question recently about what's the favorite book, the most impactful book you've read over the past year, and it was actually it's a coming of age story. I started reading the books on Ali Velshie's banned book list, and you mentioned I received the Judith Krug Medal recently from Phi Beta Kappa, and Judith Krug was one of the founders of Banned Books Week, and so it's Dante and Aristotle discover the secrets of the universe. It's a lovely book. So that has had an influence on me. And I was thinking about the books that I read as a child, and I wouldn't have access to them today. But I only had access to books. I didn't have any books. I grew up in a house that didn't have books. But I would go to the public library, and I remember reading Gideon's Trumpet. And it impacted my aspirations. I still write on conditions of confinement and prisoners' rights. But the criminal justice system and the ways in which the law often has little to do with justice. And so that was an impactful book. And of course, I was reading things I shouldn't have been reading at the time as a child, really, not even a young adult, like In Cold Blood and Jim Bouton's Ball 4, which was so I'm sorry. But I wish it could be things like,
No, this is great.
Jane Austen or something, but it wasn't.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Ray Herbersky. I'm an associate dean at Indiana University in Indianapolis, and I have a question about time horizons. So it seems to me that a lot of us work under a very short view of what the future holds. Part of it is that our students feel like they need to get a job. Part of it, and I don't know how many people are dealing with this, have consultants coming to their campus, and we have a very short amount of time to figure out what to do with programs such as philosophy or religious studies that have been on our campuses for decades, and now those degrees might be discontinued. And I'm wondering how you expand these time horizons, because it seems to me your story about loving literature doesn't have anything to do with what comes next. It was living within the moment and appreciating something that's somewhat timeless. But I really feel this crunch in between what we are being forced to address or account for, both as academics and as administrators and as people who are trying to help our students, and our students are feeling the same kind of crunch. And I'm very inspired by a lot of what you're talking about. But I feel like there's a gap. We're living in a vice, and I'm not sure how to square those two things, those two time horizons.
Yeah. That's such a good question, an important question. We know the average tenure for presidents now is 5.9 years, and a change in leadership destabilizes institutions. We are expected to do more with less, but to act quickly, and if change isn't made quickly, then we're booted out the door as leaders. And yet, in a system that depends upon shared governance, change is slow. My colleague Fred Lawrence, who is CEO of Phi Beta Kappa, says that campuses are places where glaciers go to relax. And I think this is true.
I'm stealing that.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I think we have to take a whole new perspective on the way we approach the challenges that we're facing, that we are here for the long haul, and reform takes time. And when I was at the University of Rhode Island, when I started, we were getting 44% of our support from the state. By the time I left, it was down to 7%. It's now around 4%. And so I faced that challenge as a Vice Provost for Academic Affairs of how to make decisions around allocation of scarce resources, what programs, what departments to fund. And in the midst of doing that, we often faced a mid-year rescission, and it was almost impossible to plan. And so there's something, the kind of model that we have for higher education right now isn't sustainable. But if I were looking at cutting programs, philosophy to programs, Russian language programs, whole range of programs, I would think about the ways in which we can reimagine higher education by infusing these disciplines throughout the curriculum. And at AAC&U, we talk about applied integrative learning, having students answer questions for which we don't already have the answers. This reliance on standardized tests is inane, asking students to answer questions for which we already know the answers. We have to prepare them to grapple with these grand challenges, the wicked problems that we're facing as a global community at a time when rapidly changing technology means rapid obsolescence, and when AI is likely to have a profound impact on the work that we're doing. So I would talk about on your campuses the urgency of reimagining higher education to meet this particular moment in time, which truly is, in my view, unprecedented. There was a time not so long ago in 1965 when Johnson signed the Higher Education Act, when there was consensus around what education was for. And we saw after the hearings on the Hill, the criticisms. Zika Manuel from Penn was saying, as a bioethicist, saying, American colleges have failed. We failed our responsibilities. It's time for a reckoning around what we're here for. Stephen Carter from Yale said the same thing. Is anything good that came out of the hearings? It's forced us to ask, what's our purpose? And but there was consensus that the purpose of higher education is to increase socioeconomic opportunity for the individual. It's a catalyst for that. It is still the major driver of socioeconomic opportunity for individuals. But Johnson also referred to the security of our nation and the world, that it's a driver for global peace. And we know from Tony Carnevale and his research that he and his colleagues did at this Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce, that a liberal education mitigates authoritarian tendencies. And this distinctive tradition that we have in American higher education of liberal education is something that we can't lose at this moment in time. And so we have to ask, how do we preserve not only the liberal education that we offer our students, but the academic freedom and institutional autonomy necessary to deliver that education in ways that achieve the objectives that Johnson outlined for individuals, for the nation, and the world.
David, you get the last question.
Oh boy. So actually my question is a great follow-on to that. I'm David Bowman, Dean of STEM at Eastern Washington University, but my most important title is Dad. And I have a kid who's in college right now, and let me tell you, as you alluded to earlier, how that changes your perspective on what we do. And my kid in college went through what almost all of us went through, a process of self-discovery, and changed his major. I changed my major like 5 times. You can't do that anymore, right? With the focus on graduation initiatives and career preparedness, which, dude, Dean of STEM, I'm all for, right? But you also have to be focused on that intellectual self-discovery, discovering the self, the whole person, the whole purpose of what higher education is for. So how can we marry them together? We focus so much on LEAP, you know, and the goals, and that's what general education does, but it's become, you know, a fast food menu that people select from to get through so they can get to what matters. How do we get back to what actually matters, which is the general education?
Well, I think...
and you have 30 seconds to answer that.
Talking about the skills, competencies, and dispositions that our students need to thrive in work, citizenship, and life. And it is not through these mandated courses where they are discouraged from being intellectually adventurous, but it is through the kind of applied integrative learning and grappling with unscripted problems and people who are different from themselves that encourage that humanistic identification, that we will get there. It is such it's a risk for us to take. But you know, I mentioned my son Spencer, educated at Hampshire, open curriculum, completely driven by student interests. He thrived and went on to get a PhD in African American studies in a more regimented institution. But it's that kind of education that all of us need to offer our students, and there are different models for that. But I guess what we need to keep in the forefront of our minds is what is at stake if we fail to do this, and who the biggest losers are. And those are those who have, as I've said earlier, are already those who are most underserved in our society. So it is an equity imperative for us to address the question that you've just raised.
And I think we need to find a different framing of it. I hate the term general education. I think we need to think differently about what we call that. Please join me again in thanking Lynn, President of American Association of Colleges and Universities. And congratulations, Lynn. Thank you so much for being here. It was wonderful.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And now Shaylee's going to come back up and give us some marching orders.
Yes, Leslie, we took a lot of notes. Mystic unity with something larger than ourselves, pedagogies of kindness, fugitive pedagogies, cognitive bandwidth, to name just a few. This illustrates why I always leave the annual meeting feeling energized, with a head full of new ideas and a heart full of hope. Now, I won't keep you long from refreshments, but I do need to tell you a couple of things. So Andrew McMichael, who is also on the ballot, but that's not why he asked me to say this. He wants you all to know, we've been getting questions, how do you do the voting, or where do you find that? So it's in the logistics tab in the Hoover app. Not the most obvious place, but maybe not every conference does it that way, so that's where they put it. And if you're still having problems with it, any of us up here would be happy to help you. Next is a refreshment break in the foyer from now until 10:45. The next set of sessions, concurrent sessions, begins at 10:45 through noon. Shout out to my assistant dean, Mary Isbell, who is here for her first time at CCAS, and I was really happy to see how many of you have signed up for that session. She's going to talk about creative and inclusive approaches to recruitment. But there are lots of other sessions that you've all signed up for, and you'll really enjoy those. Following the concurrent session is the lunch plenary with Brian Alexander back here in Lone Star, DE. We look forward to seeing you then.